Leading and succeeding with change work is difficult. What makes it more difficult is not knowing how to create the conditions for change to occur at team, organizational, and network levels. This is how most change agents operate. It reflects a tremendous blind spot, greatly diminishing one's ability to successfully deliver fast, largely resistance-free, and sustainable change. Hence, in this post, we discuss how to create the conditions for change to occur at team level, as this is where most of us spend most of our time. Learning how to intentionally orchestrate the right conditions for transformative change to occur is vital to succeed today in solving any complex adaptive challenge. Let's discuss. Welcome to another episode of All Things OD, where I'm here to help you offer more, be more, and live more. Whether you're serving as an OD practitioner, change management professional, or business transformation consultant. I'm your host, Randall Scott, and it's great to be with you here today. As mentioned in today's episode, we're going to discuss what it means to create the conditions for change to occur. You'll learn why creating the conditions for change matters. You'll also learn how to create the conditions for change to occur at team level. And lastly, you'll learn the key outputs that emerge when creating the right conditions. Now, before we begin, I want to let you know about a new flagship course that we're offering called Leading Through Complexity. This course is an 8-week online action learning-based course that will help you learn how to lead transformational change efforts in less time with less resistance and that will sustain over time. Our next cohort is forming now, and seats are limited, so if you're interested in changing the way that change is done, visit our website at henosispartners.com/LTC, or if you're watching on YouTube, simply click on the link in the description below. All right, let's jump in. We begin by asking the question, what does it mean to create the conditions for change to occur? What is important for you to know is that when we mention the phrase or say the phrase, create the conditions for change to occur, what we're talking about is about creating a generative container, a container to provide the necessary scaffolding to midwife the new seeing, new thinking, new acting, and new feeling. In addition to that, creating the conditions for change to occur also reflects intentional design. It's about thoughtfully thinking through the complex adaptive challenge that's in front of you, who will be partaking in solving such challenge, and then the context in which you will be attempting to solve the challenge. And finally, creating the conditions for change to occur is about assembling the puzzle pieces, in this case, enabling constraints, to increase the conditional probability that you will succeed with your change efforts. And there are 3 levels where we are needing to create the right conditions for change. There's the team level, the organizational level, and network level. Now, for purposes of today's episode, we'll just be discussing how to create the conditions for change at team level. Now, before we get into the specific conditions to create at team level to succeed with solving a complex adaptive challenge, we first need to address the question, why does creating the conditions for change matter? And in answering this question, it's important for you to know that there are 2 primary ways to approach your transformational change efforts. The first approach is that we try to make change happen. This transformational change approach is the typical path chosen by most change agents. It is a change approach that reflects imposed change, where the change agent serves as the hero. It's also an approach that reflects more of a top-down or expert-led effort, and in this regard, it reflects more of a direct route to change. Now, the trouble with this approach, this make change happen approach, is that it results in a 70% failure rate. And the reason for this is that this approach fails to meaningfully engage those that are most affected by change. That is, those within operations or on the front line. And because those individuals aren't meaningfully engaged, it leads to greater resistance to change. And it's because of both of those conditions that the change ultimately is unsustainable. It's for all of these reasons that making change happen is not the approach that you want to take to bring about any type of transformational change. Another way that we can approach change is to create the conditions for change to occur. And this transformational change approach represents the road less traveled. With this approach, the change is more collaborative in nature, and the role of the change agent is not as hero, but more as a designer of change. In contrast to the make change happen approach, this reflects more of a bottom-up or stakeholder-led effort. And in this regard, it reflects more of an indirect route to change. And largely because it is a bottom-up stakeholder effort that's taking an indirect route to change, the success rate is well over 90%. And the reason for that is that with this approach, the create the conditions for change to occur approach, we look to bridge the gaps between stakeholders, between their different perspectives and points of view. And in this regard, this approach is about uniting stakeholders to achieving a common intention or common goal. And finally, the reason why creating the conditions for change to occur is so successful is that we're catalyzing a collective action amongst the key stakeholders. Specifically, we're catalyzing commitment, we're catalyzing engagement, and most importantly, we're catalyzing ownership of the transformation effort. And it's for all of these reasons that I say creating the conditions for change to occur is a far superior approach to leading and bringing about transformational change efforts. And so back to our question of why does creating the conditions for change matter? Well, with one change approach, as we've seen, it results in a 70% failure rate, while with a different change approach, it results in over a 90% success rate. And the difference between success and failure had to do with the underlying conditions that were created in an attempt to bring about change. All right, with having addressed the questions of what does it mean to create the conditions for change to occur, and why creating the conditions for change matters, let's next address how to create the conditions for change to occur at team level. When trying to bring about transformative change at team level, it's largely about creating the right container or setting the right context for change. We refer to this as Part A of creating the conditions for change. And to set the proper context, what it entails is intentionally orchestrating a complex mix of context-dependent constraints. And when we talk about constraints in this regard, we're talking more about enabling constraints, as opposed to the more typical connotation of constricting type of constraints. And so there are two primary categories of context-dependent enabling constraints. The first category is what we refer to as containing constraints. And within this, there are two subcategories, the first of which are attractors. Attractor constraints are the type of constraints that bring people together. And there are two in particular that we want to highlight. The first is the attractor of having to solve for a complex adaptive challenge. So this is a challenge that has certain importance or urgency for the system or organization that you're working with. Getting people to rally around a complex adaptive challenge to solve for is an important attractor, and it's part of the context that we need to create. Another attractor to include within our context are different identities and the path dependencies that go with that. So what we're talking about here specifically are individuals, and how individuals and their path dependency, or another way to say that is their lived history, can also serve as an attractor. And so the way that this informs us in setting our context is the need to identify and invite certain individuals to participate in the transformational change effort, because their identity, their lived history, so to speak, will serve as an important attractor to bring others to also participate in solving the complex adaptive challenge. In addition to that, another containing constraint is what we refer to as boundaries. And one boundary enabling constraint is containment. So the spatial dynamics of containment, whether it's virtual or in person, serves as an important enabling constraint in bringing people together to solve for the complex challenge. And so in this regard, containment speaks to a spatial dynamic, both physical and cultural in nature. And finally, another boundary constraint to set the proper context is requisite diversity. And this is about maximizing diversity, both demographic and cognitive diversity. And we do this to make sure that The full breadth of perspectives and points of views are represented within the container. And in doing that, you increase your chances of not only identifying the underlying conditions that has resulted in the complex adaptive challenge that the team is trying to solve for, but also being able to identify a more holistic set of potential solutions to solve for the adaptive challenge. So attractors and boundaries serve as important containing constraints to set the proper context. In addition to that, we also have another category of enabling constraints called coupling constraints. And a subcategory underneath this is what we refer to as connections. So one connection-based enabling constraint is what we refer to as functional entanglement. And functional entanglement basically states that I can't solve the complex adaptive challenge without you, and you can't solve it without me. That there's a certain amount of entanglement that exists to solve for the challenge adequately. So this serves as an important connection-based constraint. Another connection-based constraint is what we refer to as dynamic network interactions. And so as we're creating our container, as we're creating a space for highly diverse people to come together to solve for a complex challenge, we want to make sure that there are dynamic interactions that are engaging all stakeholders to expose their uncritically held assumptions, their cognitive biases, their limiting beliefs. We want to make sure that the underlying issues of the complex adaptive challenge are being surfaced for challenge and possible revision. And what goes hand in hand with dynamic network interactions are direct and indirect feedback loops. And so we want to create a context where the conversations amongst individuals, the interactions that people are having, actually feed back and influence the broader context. It's these feedback loops that ultimately create a governing constraint that results in the transformation that we're looking for. Another form of coupling constraint is what we refer to as exchanges. And one form of an exchange constraint is that the stakeholders engage in more of a dialogic-based conversation. Having stakeholders participate in more of a dialogic-based conversation versus a debate is a key condition to create to enable transformation to occur. And finally, and most importantly, we need to create an environment of psychological safety and trust. This represents another form of an exchange-based constraint. So collectively then, these 9 constraints represent a complex mix of constraints that help us set the right context to realize transformational change. Now you may be asking yourself, why should we focus on establishing these constraints as opposed to a different set of constraints? Well, it's important for you to know that the 9 constraints that I shared with you aren't just a random set of constraints. In fact, the 9 constraints represent what we refer to as a constraint architecture. And so let me share with you some background of why these 9 constraints help us in realizing the transformative change that we're looking for. As a constraint architecture, each constraint feeds into other constraints, which, as I'll show, creates a new possibility space for transformation to occur. So, for example, psychological safety and trust. This is a core enabling constraint. We refer to this as a first-order constraint. And psychological safety and trust feeds into containment, which serves as its own enabling constraint. Containment, then, serves as an important enabler to solving for a complex adaptive challenge, which in this particular case is serving as more of a governing constraint, as the complex adaptive challenge is likely a challenge that leadership is looking to solve for. Separate from that is that the world serves as a governing constraint that influences each and every one of us in terms of shaping our identity and determining our path dependencies. Identity and path dependency serves as a dependent constraint, and this constraint feeds into or enables the constraint of requisite diversity. Together then, having to solve for a complex adaptive challenge with a requisite diverse team leads to the necessary functional entanglement that we spoke of earlier. Functional entanglement in this regard serving as another important enabling constraint. Functional entanglement, in turn, serves as an important enabling constraint of dynamic network interactions. Dynamic network interactions serves as an important governing constraint that feeds dialogic-based engagement. which itself serves as an enabling constraint. And dialogic-based engagement feeds the direct and indirect feedback loops, which serve as an important governing constraint. And those direct and indirect feedback loops inspire deeper and more meaningful functional entanglement. In fact, it's these four constraints of functional entanglement, dynamic network interactions, dialogic-based engagement, and direct and indirect feedback loops that creates a form of autocatalysis, where in an iterative way, new information is constantly being shared amongst the different stakeholders, and that new information feeds back to inform and influence the evolving context. And it's that iterative pattern which ultimately produces what we refer to as a second-order governing constraint. This second-order governing constraint creating a basin of attraction. It creates a new possibility space for things to emerge, new seeing, new thinking, new acting, and new feeling. One way to describe the basin of attraction, or this new possibility space, is that the stakeholders that you've convened to solve for the complex adaptive challenge have certain interdependencies amongst them. That is, as they interact with one another, they are both simultaneously constraining each other and are being constrained by the space itself, from parts to whole and whole to parts. And so this basin of attraction represents a self-contained and coherent hyper-constraint or pattern that's formed in virtue of the interlocking lower-level constraints. And what's happening with the interactions that are occurring amongst and between stakeholders and the broader context that they are co-creating is that there's an ongoing remembrance, that there is a path dependency to the conversations themselves, that there's increasing interdependence with each turn of the wheel, so to speak, that there's increasing complexity, increasing coordination dynamics now occurring in more of a top-down way or top-down manner, and that there's increasing coherence. And so the main takeaway here is that all of these constraints are just not random constraints that we're looking to establish our context. All of these constraints have interdependencies with one another, and collectively those interdependencies create a certain context for transformational results to occur. So creating the context represents part A of creating the conditions for change to occur. And in creating such context, it results in part B of generating a certain ambiance within our container. With our constraint architecture now acting in a top-down causative manner, it's generating a certain ambiance or atmospheric conditions within the container itself. Conditions such as autocatalytic dynamics of conflicting, tension, and friction. Conditions of disruption, uncertainty, and instability. Our constraint architecture is creating a certain ambiance of rapidly changing needs and nonlinear emergence of new ideas, new behaviors, and novelty. Another condition that's created are mutually dependent relations, as interdependencies deepen and develop amongst and between stakeholders. In addition to that, we see autocorrelated patterns of energy, as initially we see individuals participating in more of an independent manner, representing their own positions or advocating for their points of view, being transformed over time in creating shared intentions amongst the broader group, where our focus on positions shift to more a focus on intentions of the broader whole. And lastly, if we've done it right, our constraint architecture will create a certain ambiance of community, connectedness, and trust. So in summary, we could say that the ambiance or climate that's created within our container is a function of the context that we've orchestrated. That is, it is a product of intentional design. So together then, creating a certain context to generate a certain ambiance creates the conditions for transformational change to occur. It creates what we refer to as our possibility space or adaptive space. Together, the context and ambiance that we've created serve as disturbing elements that push a system towards chaos. And it's exactly those conditions or that chaos that evokes certain predictable adaptive leadership behaviors. That is, from the chaos, certain contextually induced patterns begin to emerge. Patterns such as increased creativity and innovation, challenging of assumptions, patterns of changing mindsets, and an aggregation and bonding of ideas. There are patterns of transformational learning occurring, as I learn your perspective and points of view, and you learn of mine. Such conditions evoke other adaptive leadership behaviors such as new narratives and generative images being born, and a self-reflection and awareness occurring amongst and between individuals. Self-organization is an important adaptive leadership behavior that emerges from the context that we've created, as is correlated action, as individuals are now all rowing in the same direction. And finally, we see an important adaptive leadership behavior of storytelling and personal vulnerability. It is from all of these adaptive leadership behaviors collectively that produces the outputs that we're looking for, of creating a shared understanding of what the underlying issues are of the complex adaptive challenge, which then leads to creating a shared intention of where to go. And together, creating shared understanding and shared intention naturally leads to aligning of actions, both individually and collectively. And finally, and unbeknownst to all, we're transforming relations all along the way. We're establishing new relations, deepening existing relations, and restoring fractured relations. Collectively, these adaptive leadership behaviors serve as stabilizing elements that push a system back towards order. So in bringing it all together then, we start with stating our intention, which is to solve for a complex adaptive challenge. From there, we look to create the conditions for change to occur. We create a certain context which leads to generating a certain ambiance. And it is from those conditions that evoke certain adaptive leadership behaviors. They're the type of behaviors that lead to catalyzing emergence of shared understanding, shared intention, aligned actions, and transformed relations. So we finish with some final thoughts on creating the conditions for change. Hopefully, through our conversation, you have learned that creating the conditions for change to occur matters. Only by creating the conditions for change to occur do we stack conditional probability on our side to succeed with transformational change. And hopefully it's also apparent that to create the conditions for change to occur reflects a context that we've orchestrated. That is, it is a product of our intentional design. And last, the formula to remember is the following. We create the right conditions to generate the right ambiance or atmosphere, to evoke the right adaptive leadership behaviors, to produce the change outputs that we're looking for. As we've learned in this episode, creating the right conditions for change to occur is largely a hidden exercise. But learning how to intentionally orchestrate the right conditions for transformative change to occur is vital to succeed today in solving any complex adaptive challenge. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you found the content in this episode helpful. Please share your comments below, and if you like this video, hit the subscribe button and click the bell to get notified of all future weekly episodes. Also, don't forget about our upcoming course, Leading Through Complexity. If you're interested in participating in our next cohort, you can register on our website at henosispartners.com/LTC, or if you're watching on YouTube, simply click on the link in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.